There are moments in royal history that become permanent scars, moments so explosive that they reshape the monarchy in ways no one ever imagined. But what happened just 1 minute ago, behind the thick stone walls of Buckingham Palace, is something no historian, no insider, and certainly no member of the public saw coming. It is the kind of royal decision whispered about for centuries, not announced. The kind that unfolds in private, signed quietly, sealed immediately, and buried under traditions older than most countries on Earth. Yet here we are. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. And the question that should be haunting the entire world right now is simple. What pushed King Charles to take the most drastic step a modern monarch can take against his own son? Because make no mistake, this wasn't a routine update. This wasn't a symbolic shift. This wasn't a mere administrative formality or ceremonial adjustment. This was a surgical removal, a clean break, a decisive severing of one branch of the royal bloodline from the ancient, meticulously guarded line of succession. Prince Harry, Meghan Markle, Archie, Lilibet, all gone from the future of the monarchy, removed, erased, and the timing raises even bigger questions. Why today? Why now? What changed so violently, so abruptly, that the king felt he had no choice but to remove not one person, not two, but an entire family unit from the line of succession? And deeper still, what did he see, hear, or discover that convinced him that the House of Windsor could no longer afford to keep them in the equation? That is the part no one is talking about yet. That is the part the palace hopes will stay buried. But stories like this never stay buried. They crack. They leak. They spill out through frantic insiders, through trembling advisors, through the shaking hands of staff members who witnessed more than they were ever meant to see. And that is where our story begins. Because the truth is simple. This moment, this decision, didn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't a burst of anger or a flash of royal frustration. It was the culmination of years of tension, scandal, betrayal, speculation, and bad blood. So much bad blood that even the walls of Buckingham Palace could feel it. But before we get to the decision itself, the ink, the signatures, the sealed documents, the hushed voices in the king's private study, we have to go back. Not far. Just far enough to understand the emotional landslide that brought us to this moment. Tell me something. Have you ever watched a relationship deteriorate in slow motion? One disagreement becoming two, two becoming five, five becoming a permanent fracture until, finally, something breaks. For the royal family, that break didn't happen during the Oprah interview. It didn't happen during the Netflix documentary. It didn't even happen during the release of Spare. No. The real break came during a moment that almost no one noticed at the time. A seemingly small gesture. A single decision made by Harry overseas that sent a ripple of fear through the palace corridors. A decision advisors begged him not to make. A decision that would ultimately trigger the king's greatest fear, the destabilization of the monarchy itself. Because here is the truth the public never hears. The monarchy is not just a family. It is a machine, a living organism, a hierarchy. A system that depends entirely on clarity, stability, and unbreakable lines of succession. Any hint of confusion, any thread of ambiguity, any cloud of uncertainty around heirs, titles, or legitimacy, and the entire system begins to shake. Harry didn't just shake it. He cracked it straight down the middle. And Meghan? Meghan brought her own storm, her own impact, her own unpredictable gravity that pulled the entire royal orbit off its axis. Whether you think she was a villain, a victim, or somewhere in between doesn't matter here. What matters is that her presence, her choices, and her ongoing global influence added pressure to an already fragile situation. But the children, Archie and Lilibet, they became the invisible fault line. Their births, their titles, their legal status, their connection to the monarchy, their relationship to the family they barely appeared with. Questions began swirling. Questions the palace never wanted associated with the royal bloodline. Questions about tradition. Questions about legitimacy. Questions about ceremony. Questions about visibility. Questions about documents that were never released. Questions about appearances that never happened. Questions about the crown's ability to verify, confirm, or even understand the role these children would play in the future of the monarchy. For a long time, The palace kept these questions behind closed doors. But doubts are like water. They always find a crack. And they did. Now ask yourself, what conversation, what phone call, what leaked message, what private report could possibly be so alarming that the king, who waited decades for the throne, who survived scandals, divorces, public humiliation, and family implosions, would choose to tear his own family from the heart of the monarchy? Imagine the king at his desk before dawn. Imagine the room lit only by a single lamp. Imagine the tremor in his hand as he signs a document that changes the next 100 years of British history. Imagine the weight of that decision. A father removing his own son. A grandfather removing his own grandchildren. A monarch removing an entire lineage. There is no version of that decision that comes lightly. There is no version that comes without fear. There is no version that comes without sacrifice. And certainly no version that comes without consequences that will echo across the globe. But what if I told you this wasn't the king's first attempt to resolve the situation? What if I told you he tried warnings first? Private conversations. Emotional appeals. Repeated attempts to clarify the Sussexes' position within the royal structure. Meetings that began with hope and ended in silence. What if I told you the king reached a breaking point after something that happened not in London, not in Windsor, but in California? Because the truth is this. Every royal decision has an invisible trigger. And the trigger for this one came from a sudden transatlantic event. One the palace could not ignore, could not excuse, and could not delay addressing. The king did not remove Harry out of anger. He removed him out of fear. Fear of chaos. Fear of instability. Fear of the monarchy unraveling under public scrutiny and internal confusion. And here is where the story sharpens. Royal insiders say that the catalyst for this removal was not Meghan, not Harry, not even the children individually. It was something or someone else. A figure behind the scenes. A person whose influence intersected directly with the children's future status. A person who raised alarm bells so loud the king had no choice but to act. Throughout this video, you will learn who that person is. You will learn what they said. You will learn why their revelation forced the king's hand. And you will learn why the royal family knows this decision, once revealed, cannot be undone. Because this was not a punishment. This was a safeguard, a protective measure. A final attempt to preserve the monarchy from a future that advisors warned might spiral into legal, public, or constitutional crisis. And now comes the question no one wants to ask, but everyone must consider. If the king removed them from the line of succession, what comes next? Do titles fall next? Do privileges? Do royal protections? Does the entire Sussex branch effectively become non-royal from this point forward? Or is this only phase one of a much larger plan the king and Prince William have been quietly preparing for years? Do not underestimate what is about to unfold. Do not underestimate the magnitude of this fallout. Do not underestimate how permanent this decision might be. Because the king did not just alter the present. He altered the future. And the next chapter begins with the document he signed at dawn. A document almost no one was supposed to see. But someone did. And what that person witnessed will unravel everything you thought you knew about this royal family. What happened next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. They say Buckingham Palace never truly sleeps. But there are hours, those fragile, icy pockets between midnight and sunrise, when its corridors fall into a silence so deep you can almost hear the building breathe. It was in that silence, long before London awoke, that King Charles made the decision that would shatter the future of the monarchy. The sun had not yet risen. The air was still. Even the guards outside, disciplined and immovable, shifted their weight as if sensing that something unnatural was about to unfold. And inside, in the private study where generations of monarchs had wrestled with impossible decisions, King Charles sat alone at his oak desk, staring at a single sheet of parchment laid before him. Not a letter, not an announcement. A legal instrument. A royal directive drafted in such careful language that each sentence carried the weight of a century. A document so sensitive that only 3 advisors had permission to handle it. And a decision so monumental that even the monarch hesitated to lift the pen. The moment was not theatrical. It wasn't grand, dramatic, or ceremonious. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that comes before a storm. But what forced the king into this dawn signing? Why couldn't it wait? Why wasn't this done during normal hours? Why was it necessary to sign away a bloodline before the rest of the world even opened their eyes? To understand, we must go back to the night before. Because what happened that night, what landed on the king's desk just after midnight, triggered this entire historic rupture. A courier from the palace legal office arrived with an urgent folder. His hands were shaking. The pages inside were warm from the printer, thick with footnotes, legal codes, constitutional implications, and a summary stamped, immediate and confidential. At the top of the first page was a line that turned the king's blood cold. Unresolved concerns regarding the succession status of the Sussex branch now present a constitutional vulnerability. Think about that for a moment. A constitutional vulnerability. Not a family dispute. Not a PR crisis. Not a tabloid scandal. A constitutional vulnerability, the one thing a monarch cannot ignore. The king read the report. Twice. Then a third time. His advisors stood nearby, shifting, watching him absorb the implications. Every detail raised deeper questions. Every question raised deeper uncertainty. And nothing is more dangerous to the monarchy than uncertainty about the legitimacy of heirs. Ask yourself, what kind of discovery could force a monarch to consider removing his own son and grandchildren from the royal succession? Could it be documentation issues? Conflicting legal claims? Unregistered birth details? Custodial questions? International residency complexities? Misrepresentations made in interviews? Invisible pressures from governments or constitutional experts? Insiders say the answer is not one of these things. It is all of them. The king was handed a nightmare, a tangled knot of issues so severe, so entangled, so public-facing, that allowing them to remain unresolved threatened to create a constitutional crisis unlike anything the monarchy had faced since the abdication of Edward VIII. And here is where the story turns even darker. One line in the report referenced recent developments from the United States which exacerbate the instability. What developments? What events across the Atlantic could influence the British line of succession? The king demanded answers. His advisors looked at one another somberly. One stepped forward and placed a sealed envelope on the desk. A message from California. A message that confirmed the palace's worst fears. The king opened it. His face drained of color. And from that moment forward, there was no turning back. He summoned his private secretary and said only one sentence. Prepare the papers. This brings us back to the study at dawn. The king sat with the document before him, the one that would remove Prince Harry and his descendants from the line of succession. The legal team had worked through the night, crafting every clause with surgical precision. Every phrasing was triple-checked to withstand constitutional scrutiny. It wasn't enough to sign it. It had to be airtight. The king touched the pen. He froze. His mind didn't go to the monarchy. It didn't go to the Constitution. It didn't go to royal duty. It went to Harry, his little boy, the boy who used to run through palace hallways, laughing, the boy who stood behind him at engagements, awkward in his suit, tugging at his collar, the boy who lost his mother in the most traumatic way possible and never fully recovered. And now that boy had grown into a man the monarchy no longer recognized. The king whispered something under his breath. No one was close enough to hear it, but an advisor claimed later that it sounded like a prayer or an apology. Then he signed the document. The pen scratched softly against the page. The signature curved elegantly, confidently, with the authority of a monarch who knew he could not afford to waver. One stroke, two strokes, three, and that was it. Centuries of tradition rewritten in less time than it took the sun to rise. But this is where things get even more unsettling. The signing of the document was only the beginning, because the king did not just sign one document. He signed two. The first removed the Sussex family from the line of succession. The second remains shrouded in secrecy. Insiders whisper that it concerns titles. Others say it concerns the future roles of the children. And some say it could trigger a complete restructuring of the monarchy's public-facing responsibilities. Whatever it was sealed immediately. And here's where the story takes a dramatic twist. At the exact moment the king finished signing the documents, the door to his study opened. An unexpected visitor walked in. Someone who was not supposed to be there. Someone whose presence in that room sparked panic among the advisors. This visitor saw the documents, saw the signatures, saw the king's expression, and realized exactly what had happened. This was not a servant, not a guard, not an assistant. This was someone with personal ties to the royal family, someone emotionally involved, someone who had reason to react strongly to what they witnessed. And they did react, so strongly, in fact, that palace staff later described the encounter as a confrontation. No raised voices, no shouting, just one sentence spoken in a strained, stunned whisper. "You actually did it." The king didn't respond. He didn't have to. His silence was confirmation. The visitor left the room. Within 15 minutes, palace staff noticed something strange. The visitor was gone. Not in their quarters, not in the palace, not anywhere inside the grounds. They had left the building in a hurry, and within hours, whispers began spreading from staff to staff, advisor to advisor, insider to insider. Someone knew what the king had done, someone who could leak it, someone who could expose it, someone who could shatter the controlled timeline the king had hoped to follow. If this information leaked too early, it could trigger a media firestorm before the palace was prepared to handle it. Worse, it could reach Harry and Meghan before the king's formal communication, creating an international crisis. The king called an emergency meeting with his private office. Every advisor in that room knew the stakes. Every advisor knew what early disclosure would mean. And every advisor understood that they were now dealing with something that had spiraled beyond the king's control. And that brings us to the most important question of all. Why was the second document even more sensitive than the first? Why did its contents stun the visitor into silence? What was so explosive, so irreversible, that even palace staff weren't allowed to see it? There are rumors, dangerous, unconfirmed, but persistent. Rumors suggesting it goes beyond succession. Rumors suggesting it involves the children's formal classification within the monarchy. Rumors suggesting it clarifies once and for all a question the palace has been avoiding for years. A question that might explain the king's true motivation for removing the Sussex line. A question that, if answered publicly, could rewrite the royal narrative forever. But we're not there yet. Because before we reach the answer, we must go deeper. We must trace the fault lines that led to the king's decision. We must understand why he hesitated. We must uncover the emotional and constitutional pressures that collided in that dawn moment. This chapter began with the signing of a document. But the story behind it, the events that forced the king's hand, the unresolved questions about the children, the midnight message from California, and the identity of the visitor who saw everything, take us into the next chapter. A chapter that reveals the part of the story the palace desperately hoped would never be connected to this decision. Because what happened next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Trust is the currency of every royal dynasty. Not money, not titles, not bloodlines. Trust. It is the invisible glue that keeps a monarchy intact, the unspoken agreement that every member of the family will act in ways that preserve, not endanger, the institution they represent. But trust is also fragile. And once broken, it rarely heals without leaving a scar. And Prince Harry, well, he didn't just crack that trust. He shattered it. The moment the king signed the Dawn document in Chapter 1 marked the conclusion of years of quiet turmoil. But the roots of that decision stretch far deeper than the palace wants the world to know. Because the truth is this, the king's level of distrust toward Harry did not begin with Meghan, or the Netflix deal, or Oprah, or the book Spare. It began long before any of that, with a choice Harry made that seemed small at the time, almost insignificant, but that carried consequences no one foresaw. Every family has a moment where the cracks first appear, a moment when something subtle shifts, like the first tremor before an earthquake. For the royal family, that moment came during a private family gathering more than a decade ago. Harry was younger then, still laughing, still loyal, still orbiting closely around the people who raised him. But he was also restless, frustrated, searching for something no royal training had taught him how to process. At that gathering, a senior royal advisor pulled Harry aside for a quiet conversation. A warning, a suggestion, a piece of guidance meant to protect him. It wasn't harsh. It wasn't scolding. It wasn't controlling. It was simply a reminder. Be careful whom you trust outside the palace. That sentence would define the next 20 years of Harry's life. Because from that moment on, Harry began forming relationships outside the palace bubble, relationships that advisors didn't approve of, relationships that raised concerns about privacy, loyalty, influence, and motives. At first, it was harmless. Harry was simply rebelling, testing boundaries, searching for freedom. But over time, something changed. The people he trusted began using him, leaking details, spreading stories, planting narratives. Harry felt betrayed, rightfully so. But instead of blaming the individuals who hurt him, he blamed the institution that warned him. That's where the disconnect began. And then Meghan entered the picture. But let's slow this down, because rushing past this moment means missing the real trigger. The palace never objected to Harry falling in love. They objected to what he did next. He brought someone into his inner circle without allowing the palace to vet, guide, or advise him. For senior royal advisors, this was unheard of. Every royal partner in modern history, Diana, Kate, Camilla, Sophie, had gone through structured introductions, gradual integration, layers of support, and protection. Harry bypassed all of that. It wasn't an act of love. It wasn't an act of defiance. It was an act of mistrust. A message sent loud and clear. I don't trust you with my future. That message shook the monarchy. Because when a senior royal no longer trusts the institution, the entire structure becomes unstable. The advisors whispered. The king worried. William intervened gently, then firmly, then desperately. But Harry didn't hear any of it. Or maybe he did, and he simply didn't believe it. He was convinced the palace would not protect him. He was convinced he had to protect himself. He was convinced he needed to rewrite the rules. And rewriting royal rules always comes at a cost. Still, even then, the king did not lose trust in his son entirely. He believed Harry was going through a phase, an emotional transformation, a painful evolution shaped by trauma, grief, and the constant war between identity and duty. But then came the interviews, the subtle jabs, the veiled criticisms, the public statements that contradicted palace accounts, then the Netflix documentary, then the Oprah interview, then Spare. And if you think the controversies were the problem, you're missing the real point. It wasn't what Harry said. It was that he said it publicly. Breaking royal protocol is one thing. Breaking the monarchy's unwritten vow of silence is another entirely. But even then, even after the accusations, the claims, the insinuations, the king still didn't sign anything. He still didn't remove Harry from the line of succession. He still hoped things could be repaired. So what changed? Why did the king suddenly lose trust so completely that he felt forced to act? It started with the security battle in the UK. Harry believed he deserved full taxpayer-funded royal protection, despite no longer being a working royal and living in California. The palace disagreed. A legal battle erupted. And in that battle, Harry made a decision that stunned the monarchy. He took the Home Office, essentially the British government, to court. A prince suing the government of the country he was born to represent. This act alone shook senior advisors. This hadn't happened in modern history. This tore open the monarchy's greatest vulnerability, political neutrality. But the deeper damage came from what Harry submitted to the court. Statements claiming he felt unsafe. Statements suggesting the royal family failed him. Statements implying the monarchy itself was a danger. These statements became public record. And once something becomes public record, it becomes ammunition. For critics, for tabloids, for political opponents, for foreign governments. That was the moment the king realized trust had been compromised on a level that could no longer be brushed aside. But the biggest break, the one that fractured the king's trust beyond repair, came from something that happened not in a courtroom, not in a TV studio, but in a meeting that was never supposed to be revealed. A private call between Harry and a senior palace advisor. No cameras, no microphones, no lawyers, just a call meant to clear the air. The advisor asked Harry a simple question. Do you still consider yourself part of this family? Harry paused for a long time. Too long. Finally, he said something the advisor never repeated word for word. But palace insiders described the tone as cold, final, detached. They said it was the first time they truly believed Harry was planning a life completely separate from the monarchy. But one detail was leaked. Harry allegedly said he no longer viewed the monarchy as a safe place for his children. That sentence hit the king harder than Oprah, Netflix, Spare, or the lawsuits combined. To the monarchy, this wasn't a son criticizing an institution. This was a son accusing the monarchy of being unsafe for future heirs. That accusation carried consequences that went beyond emotion. It affected the stability of the monarchy. It triggered constitutional alarms. It raised questions that could not be ignored. Because if Harry believed the monarchy was unsafe, if Meghan believed the monarchy was unsafe, if the children were supposedly unsafe, then what role could they possibly play in the future of the institution? How could heirs who reject the monarchy ever be expected to maintain it? And here's where things spiraled. Advisors began compiling a report, not emotionally, but legally, not as a retaliation, but as a necessity, not to punish Harry, but to protect the monarchy. They traced Harry's actions, his public statements, his legal battles, his media deals, his inconsistent relationship with the family, his refusal to attend certain key events, his wavering allegiance to the crown, his declaration that he wanted nothing to do with the institution, except, occasionally, when it benefited him. The report concluded with one chilling line. The crown can no longer rely on the Sussex branch to uphold or protect the integrity of the monarchy. Integrity, trust, stability. Those three pillars had been shaken beyond repair. But the breaking point, the moment the king officially lost trust, was still yet to come. Because what pushed the king over the edge wasn't Harry walking away from the monarchy. It was Harry trying to take pieces of it with him. A project, a deal, a proposal made in the United States. One that attempted to use royal branding, royal history, and royal access in ways that advisors said crossed every line of royal protocol. When the details of that project reached the king, he allegedly whispered, "He's not trying to leave the monarchy. He's trying to reinvent it." And that was the moment the king finally understood that Harry and the monarchy were on two paths that would never converge again. You cannot have an heir who rejects the system. You cannot have a prince who distrusts the crown. You cannot have a family branch that moves independently, without accountability, without structure, without alignment. Trust wasn't merely broken. It was gone. Completely. And so the king made the decision. But losing trust in Harry was only part of the story. Because what came next involved the children. And that is where the king faced the hardest truth of all. If he no longer trusted Harry, could he trust the lineage that came after him? The answer would force him into the most painful choice a monarch could ever make. And what he did next would change the future of the royal family forever. But no one saw it coming that if the king's distrust of Harry was the first fracture, Meghan Markle was the force that widened it. Not because she intended to. Not because she planned to. But because the royal household underestimated her, misunderstood her, mishandled her, and ultimately pushed her into a position where conflict was no longer accidental. It was inevitable. Every story has a turning point. This one begins with an email. A single email. One that arrived at the palace inbox at 6:47 a.m. An email that senior royal staff still whisper about in corridors. An email that no one wants to talk about publicly. Because that email, according to insiders, was the moment the royal household realized they had misjudged Meghan completely. But let's not rush to the email. To understand why that message mattered so much, we need to go back to the early days. The days when Meghan was still the breath of fresh air. The glamorous newcomer. The stunning American actress who captivated Harry and initially charmed the world. The palace welcomed her at first. With caution, yes, but with genuine hope. They believed she could modernize the monarchy, bring new energy, bridge cultures, and strengthen the crown's global influence. But from the very beginning, one thing was clear. Meghan was not Kate. She was not Diana. She was not Camilla. She was Meghan, her own force, her own personality, her own identity. And that alone made her impossible for the palace to predict. The first misstep, the first moment of tension didn't come from Meghan. It came from the hierarchy surrounding her. The palace staff, those who had spent decades shaping the behavior of royals, tried to mold her too quickly. Meghan was expected to learn centuries-old rules overnight, adapt to protocols she had never heard of, smile when she felt scrutinized, and stay silent when she felt misunderstood. But Meghan was not built for silence. She questioned everything, asked why certain rules existed, pushed back on norms, challenged traditions. For the monarchy, questioning is dangerous. It implies doubt. Doubt implies instability. Instability implies vulnerability. And vulnerability is the one thing the monarchy cannot afford. The palace's first major concern emerged during a private staff meeting shortly after Meghan's engagement. Several aides expressed discomfort with her assertiveness. They expected a learning curve. What they got was a woman who wanted answers, not just instructions. But here is the part no one ever understands. Meghan's assertiveness wasn't rebellion. It was survival. She had entered a world where every move was scripted, every gesture monitored, every word analyzed. She wasn't trying to disrespect the monarchy. She was trying to protect herself from losing her identity. But from that moment forward, the royal household formed an opinion of her. She was difficult, and once that label sticks inside the palace, it shapes everything that follows. The pressure begins. The royal press machine began circling her like sharks. Headlines twisted her intentions. Photographs froze her at the worst angle possible. Pundits dissected her body language, tone, wardrobe, facial expressions. And every time Meghan tried to defend herself privately, the palace responded with the same chilling phrase. "We don't comment on tabloid speculation." That sentence became the cage she couldn't escape. And Harry? He saw his wife breaking. He saw the flashbacks to what happened to his mother. He saw the emotional storm building. He begged the palace to intervene. Release a statement. Correct the narrative. Protect Meghan the same way they protected others. The palace refused. That refusal would become one of the greatest strategic mistakes in modern royal history, because Meghan interpreted it as betrayal. A heartbreaking, deeply personal betrayal. The moment everything shifted. The breaking point between Meghan and the royal household didn't happen on a balcony, or during a walkabout, or in a meeting room lined with portraits of dead kings. It happened behind a closed door, during a conversation that became palace legend. Meghan confronted a senior aide after weeks of negative press. She asked why lies were being printed about her unchecked. She asked what the palace was doing to stop the harassment. She asked if anyone cared about the toll it was taking on her mental health. The aide responded with something so cold, so callous, that even staff members who overheard it later said they felt sick. "You are not the priority. The institution is." That sentence cracked something inside Meghan. Because to her, the institution had become the threat. This wasn't the Hollywood she knew. This wasn't the industry she had worked in. This wasn't the world where she could call out injustice, speak to her publicist, craft her narrative, or defend herself. In the palace, her voice belonged to them. Her image belonged to them. Her story belonged to them. And she couldn't accept it. The rehearsals. When Meghan joined the royal family, she went through briefing sessions, meetings designed to teach her everything from posture to greetings to walking pace to eye contact. Meghan attended, took notes, asked questions. But something unusual happened. She began pushing back. Why must curtsy rules differ? Why can't she hug people? Why can't she express emotions in speeches? Why must every public statement be rewritten by 5 different people? Why did the press office protect others more aggressively than they protected her? These questions rattled the monarchy because they sounded reasonable. Reasonable questions are the hardest to silence. The first official feud. The palace would later blame it on misunderstandings, but insiders know the truth. Meghan's first major conflict wasn't with Kate. It was with a senior communications officer, someone who believed Meghan needed to be handled. Handled. That word ignited an inferno. Meghan refused to be handled, refused to be controlled, refused to be reduced to a silent ornament of the crown. And the more she resisted, the more the palace tightened its grip. The email. This is where everything converges. This is where Chapter 3's hook returns. At 6:47 a.m., Meghan sent an email directly to a senior palace official. The contents were never fully leaked, but here's what insiders reported. Her email expressed deep emotional distress, concerns about unfair treatment, confusion over hostile behavior from staff, alarm over lack of support, fear that her mental health was deteriorating, a plea for intervention, a request for fairness, a request for protection. Meghan didn't threaten. She didn't attack. She pleaded. And that email became the moment the palace realized the situation had reached a crisis point. But something even more shocking followed. Because within hours of sending the email, details of its existence, not the content, but its existence, leaked to a journalist. Not from Meghan, not from Harry, from someone inside the palace. Whether intentional or accidental, the impact was catastrophic. Meghan realized she couldn't trust the household. Not with her safety, not with her privacy, not with her voice, not with her marriage, not with her future children. And when trust evaporates, resistance begins. The resistance. Meghan began pushing back harder than ever. She changed schedules, rejected speeches rewritten by palace aides, demanded involvement in decisions, asked to work with teams outside traditional royalty-approved professionals, sought independence, sought flexibility, sought autonomy. But the palace had a pattern for outsiders. The more independent they are, the more threatening they become. The more Meghan asserted herself, the more the palace labeled her disruptive. The more she asked questions, the more they labeled her challenging. The more she refused outdated traditions, the more they labeled her uncontrollable. And behind closed doors, those labels became evidence. Evidence later used in internal discussions about her suitability. Evidence used to justify withholding information from her. Evidence used to escalate concerns to the king. Evidence used to paint her as a destabilizing factor. Evidence used to argue that the Sussex branch was becoming unpredictable. But the breaking point wasn't Meghan's behavior. It wasn't her questions. It wasn't her independence. It wasn't her refusal to play the role. It was what came next. A decision Meghan made, a personal one, that sent shockwaves through the palace and triggered a chain reaction that ultimately influenced the king's final decision to remove her children from the line of succession. Because Meghan, exhausted, overwhelmed, and increasingly aware she could not survive the palace system, approached Harry one night and said a sentence that would echo through royal history. "I can't stay here." Harry agreed. Plans shifted. A new strategy formed in secret. Not the half-in, half-out model. Not the working royal from afar idea. Something bigger. A departure. A break. A separation from the institution itself. And once Meghan made that decision, the palace saw it clearly. If the mother intended to leave the monarchy entirely, what future would that create for the children? The children became the center of every conversation, every meeting, every legal inquiry, every constitutional concern. The palace feared something it couldn't control. Heirs who might disappear overseas indefinitely. Heirs raised outside royal values. Heirs rejecting the monarchy altogether. Heirs influenced by Hollywood, not the crown. Heirs whose public image could not be regulated. Heirs whose very legitimacy could be questioned publicly without palace intervention. Meghan's breaking point didn't end with her stepping back. It marked the beginning of the palace's fears. And those fears became the foundation of the king's ultimate decision. Because the question haunting the monarchy became, if the parents no longer believe in the institution, how can their children inherit it? But the true catalyst, the moment that escalated this fear into crisis, came when palace advisors uncovered something about the children that amplified every concern they already had. And that revelation triggered the next phase of the king's drastic plan. Because what they found out next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. For months, maybe even years, the palace tried to avoid the topic. They tiptoed around it, whispered about it only in the most secure rooms, and treated it like a live wire no one wanted to touch. But eventually, the question that had been lurking in the shadows became too big to ignore. What exactly was the status of Archie and Lilibet in the eyes of the crown? It wasn't simple. It wasn't superficial. It wasn't petty. This wasn't about favoritism. This wasn't about personal feelings. This wasn't about the children themselves. It was about something far bigger, something constitutional. Because in the monarchy, children are not just children. They are symbols. They are heirs. They are future ambassadors, future stabilizers, future tools of diplomacy, future protectors of tradition. Their existence carries legal implications. Their titles carry national implications. Their whereabouts carry international implications. Every royal child has paperwork. Every royal child has protocols. Every royal child has visibility. Every royal child has documentation, ceremonies, confirmations, and official records. But with Archie and Lilibet, the palace realized they had something unprecedented. A pair of royal children whose lives existed almost entirely outside the kingdom they were born into. And that created questions no monarch had ever been forced to answer. Not in 1,000 years. The invisible royal children. Let's start with the simplest truth, the one that shook palace advisors the most. Archie and Lilibet were almost never seen. There were no traditional public events. No balcony appearances. No christening photos released in real time. No annual portraits from Kensington Palace photographers. No official UK-based birthdays. no integration into royal family gatherings. And while the Sussexes argued that privacy was protection, the palace saw something different. A constitutional vacuum. Because how do you verify, document, and secure heirs who are raised completely outside the royal system? How do you integrate them? How do you prepare them? How do you protect them? How do you prove their eligibility? How do you confirm compliance with centuries-old succession rules? How do you maintain public trust when the public cannot see the heirs? You cannot run a monarchy on assumptions. You cannot base the line of succession on mystery. You cannot gamble on the unknown. And the unknown was growing. The first red flag. It started small. With a missing detail in an internal briefing document regarding Archie's early life protocols. Something an advisor noticed late one night. Something that should have been routine. But it wasn't there. A box that should have been ticked wasn't. That gap triggered a quiet search through palace archives to confirm the necessary documentation. The search expanded across departments, then across offices, then across legal channels. More gaps appeared, more inconsistencies, more missing confirmations. Some were minor clerical issues. Others were more concerning. But the most alarming one involved the children's deeper constitutional status. The second red flag. Traditionally, royal children are raised under the guidance of the crown, even when their parents aren't physically living inside palace walls. Advisors have access. The monarchy maintains visibility. The institution has oversight. But for Archie and Lilibet, there was no oversight at all. Not ceremonial. Not structural. Not archival. Not developmental. Not security-based. Not even traditional royal mentorship arrangements. They were fully disconnected. The palace wasn't trying to control them. It was trying to understand them. It was trying to locate them in the royal system. Because heirs cannot float in administrative limbo. Yet that is exactly what was happening. The third red flag. The next issue appeared during a review of royal lineage presentation guidelines. When the Palace Communications Office prepared updated materials that included the line of succession, something unusual happened. Each department presented slightly different interpretations of Archie and Lilibet's positions. That had never happened in modern monarchy history. There was always total clarity, because the rules were straightforward. But now there were discrepancies. Tiny at first, but symbolic of a deeper problem. Even the monarchy's internal branches were not aligned on how to classify the children. The fourth red flag. When advisors approached the Sussexes for clarification about documentation, ceremonies, protocols, or confirmations, responses were minimal or delayed. Sometimes months went by with no reply. Sometimes a response came but did not provide the requested clarity. Sometimes communication passed through intermediaries, not directly. Advisors began to panic quietly. Not publicly, not maliciously, but constitutionally. Because the monarchy is not designed to operate on uncertainty. Yet uncertainty was growing like a weed. The fifth red flag. A high-level royal advisor, one close to the king, requested a full structural assessment of the children's royal standing. The findings shocked even him. According to multiple palace insiders, the report stated, there is insufficient information to confidently assert the constitutional readiness or availability of the Sussex children for future royal duties or roles. That was the moment the palace realized the issue was no longer theoretical. The children's future was a legal matter. Not emotional, not political, not personal, legal. Because the monarchy is not just a family. It is a state institution built on structure and continuity. What the advisors feared most was simple. If Archie and Lilibet were called upon in the future, would they even be prepared? Would they accept the role? Would they understand it? Would they reject it? Would they be legally ready? Would they pose a constitutionally unstable branch of the monarchy? But things escalated even further, because the palace uncovered something that turned all their concerns into alarm bells. The catalyst moment. During a routine cross-check of international documentation, a process done every few years for all international-born royals, advisors discovered a discrepancy involving Lilibet's early life records and their interaction with UK protocols. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't misconduct. It wasn't wrongdoing. It was simply confusion, a detail that could be interpreted multiple ways. And anything that can be interpreted multiple ways is dangerous for the monarchy, because ambiguity breeds speculation. Speculation breeds conspiracy. Conspiracy breeds distrust. Distrust destroys monarchies. But the real crisis came when one advisor asked this question. What if the children, being raised outside of royal structures, eventually reject their royal roles? What if they don't want to represent the crown? What if they prefer American life? What if they refuse titles? What if they refuse to be used in diplomacy? What if they grow up critical of the monarchy? Because if the monarchy maintains them in the line of succession, and the children later refuse the role, it would create the biggest constitutional embarrassment since Edward VIII abdicated for Wallace Simpson. And that was the moment everything shifted. The internal debates. Senior legal teams, constitutional scholars, royal historians, and advisors gathered over the course of weeks, then months, analyzing every angle. The debates were heated, emotional, complex. Some argued the children should remain in the succession line out of tradition. Others argued that tradition can't override clarity. Some argued that the monarchy must modernize. Others argued that modernization cannot come at the cost of constitutional stability. Some said the Sussexes deserved the benefit of the doubt. Others said the monarchy deserved protection from uncertainty. The king listened to every side. He kept every file. He read every report. He asked his advisors the same question repeatedly. What protects the monarchy? Not what protects Harry. Not what protects Meghan. Not what protects the children. What protects the monarchy? And every answer pointed to the same painful conclusion. Uncertainty is the monarchy's greatest threat, and the Sussex children represented a future of uncertainty. The private meeting. This is where things take a dramatic turn. The king held a private meeting with a single senior advisor. No staff, no secretaries, no witnesses, just the two of them in a quiet sitting room at Clarence House. The advisor laid out everything. Every document, every discrepancy, every unanswered question, every constitutional risk, every future instability, every logistical challenge, every public relations catastrophe waiting to happen. The king said nothing for a long time. Then he spoke one sentence. If we cannot guarantee clarity, we cannot guarantee continuity. The advisor nodded. And then the king asked the question that would change everything. What happens if we remove them? The advisor sighed and replied. Then the monarchy becomes stable again. The king's struggle. You have to understand the emotional weight of this moment. This wasn't a cold decision. This wasn't a political decision. This wasn't a strategic move. It was heartbreaking. A grandfather asking whether his grandchildren should be stripped of succession status. A father asking whether his son's choices had made the monarchy incompatible with a future generation. A monarch realizing he was dealing with an unprecedented situation. Archie and Lilibet were innocent. But innocence does not remove constitutional uncertainty. The king wrestled with the decision for weeks. He consulted historians. He consulted legal scholars. He consulted international advisors. He consulted church authorities. And every consultation led him to the same answer. A monarchy cannot carry unknown heirs. But even all of this, every report, every fear, every debate, was not the final push. What forced the king to act was something even more troubling. Something that happened in America. A development involving the children. A development advisors considered dangerous. A development that escalated every concern into immediate crisis. A development that the king learned about the night before he signed the document. And what he read in that message would change the entire future of the monarchy, but no one saw it coming. If the monarchy is a fortress, advisors are its guards. They protect it, shield it, preserve it. They manage crises before they reach the king. They filter information. They kill problems in silence. And because of that, advisors almost never break rank. Almost. There are rare moments, once in a generation, when an advisor steps forward and does something unthinkable. They tell the monarch a truth he doesn't want to hear. And this moment, the moment that pushed King Charles into action, didn't come from tabloids, the British public, Parliament, foreign governments, or even the media. It came from one advisor. One person. One voice inside the palace walls. A loyalist. A veteran. A royal servant who had stood by the monarchy through scandals, divorces, deaths, betrayals, wars, and public upheaval. A person who had sworn never to interfere, yet broke that oath. Because what they uncovered about the Sussex family, about the children's status, their circumstances, their future, and an explosive development from the United States, left them shaking. This advisor did not intend to blow the whistle. They didn't want to be involved. They didn't want to be the spark. But the truth is simple. They believed the monarchy was in danger. And so they stepped forward. The advisor's identity. The palace has never confirmed this person's name. They won't. They can't. Doing so would trigger lawsuits, public outrage, and media wars. But palace insiders described this person in whispers. Someone who had been with the royal household for decades. Someone respected by all branches of the family. Someone who had worked under Queen Elizabeth II's direct instruction. Someone deeply protective of the monarchy's structure. Someone who saw patterns others ignored. Someone who ultimately decided silence was more dangerous than truth. This wasn't a rebel. This wasn't an opportunist. This wasn't a bitter staffer seeking revenge. This was a guardian of the crown. And the moment they realized something was very wrong, they made a choice that altered history. The first warning. The advisor approached the king's private secretary with a request for an emergency briefing. That alone sent shockwaves through the palace. Advisors don't request emergency briefings unless the situation is dire. The secretary asked what the matter concerned. The advisor's answer was chilling. It concerns the line of succession. Not Meghan. Not Harry. Not scandals. Not PR blunders. The succession. The heartbeat of the monarchy. The secretary wasted no time and arranged for the advisor to meet the king privately. But before the advisor even spoke to the king, they gave a warning to the secretary. This cannot be delayed. This cannot be softened. This cannot be ignored. And then came the first revelation. Anomalies. The advisor explained that during a routine review, they found inconsistencies, gaps, and irregularities related to the Sussex children. Not accusations, just gaps. But in the monarchy, gaps are as dangerous as scandals. When the secretary asked for examples, the advisor listed them. Delayed communications. Conflicting information between departments. Unconfirmed ceremonial traditions. Missed reporting milestones. Lack of access to documentation. Absence from crucial archival processes. International complications that raised legal questions. And most troubling of all, something the advisor called an American irregularity. No one knew what that meant. Not yet. But the advisor insisted that the king must hear everything directly, without filters, without delays, without palace polishing. The king convenes a private meeting. Within 24 hours, King Charles, the advisor, the private secretary, and one senior legal counsel gathered in a small conference room at Clarence House. It was not a formal meeting. It wasn't even recorded in the daily log. This meeting was off the books. Just 4 people. No aides. No guards. No courtiers. The king asked for clarity, and the advisor delivered it. A blow-by-blow presentation. This advisor had prepared a written dossier. Thick, heavy, organized, detailed. They walked the king through each section. Early life documentation issues. Missing ceremonial confirmations. International complications affecting status. Gaps in communication with the Sussex household. Concerning signals about the children's upbringing. Potential legal contradictions in cross-border classifications. The impact on future diplomatic roles. The potential for succession disputes decades later. The constitutional vulnerability growing around the Sussex branch. As the advisor spoke, the king began rubbing his forehead in slow, tense movements, a sign he was overwhelmed. But then the advisor reached the section that changed the tone of the room completely. The American irregularity. The discovery from the United States. The advisor revealed a detail the palace had not been fully aware of, something that had occurred abroad involving the Sussex children, their legal classifications, and the way certain U.S. procedures intersected with UK constitutional rules. The details were complicated, technical, and explosive. The king frowned. He asked one question. Why wasn't this brought to me sooner? The advisor answered. Because the full implications weren't understood until now. But here's the part that turned this from a concern into a crisis. The advisor had already consulted external constitutional experts, quietly, discreetly, unofficially. Their verdict was unanimous. If this issue remained unresolved, it could undermine the integrity of the royal succession. The king's face went pale. The moment of tension. The king leaned back, closed his eyes, exhaled slowly. Then he asked a question that made the room go silent. Are you telling me the future heirs of the monarchy could be questioned? The advisor nodded. Not because of wrongdoing. Not because of conspiracy, because of structural uncertainty. Uncertainty is poison for monarchies. It weakens the foundation. It erodes public trust. It invites political scrutiny. It opens doors to legal challenges. It gives ammunition to critics. It threatens stability. And then came the final blow. The warning. The advisor ended the briefing with a statement so stark that even the legal counsel flinched. The monarchy cannot afford heirs who are ambiguous. The king stared at the advisor. And then the advisor delivered the sentence that would change royal history. If the Sussex children remain in the succession, they introduce a constitutional risk that may one day force the monarchy into crisis. That was it. That was the moment the king realized this situation had left the realm of emotion and entered the realm of national security. A decision the advisor never wanted to make. The advisor didn't want Harry punished, didn't want Meghan vilified, didn't want the children harmed. In fact, the advisor said something that surprised the king. I believe the children are innocent in this. They deserve clarity, but clarity cannot exist under these circumstances. The advisor didn't blow the whistle out of spite. They blew it out of duty. A duty to the crown. A duty to the Constitution. A duty to the future of the monarchy. For the king, the weight of that duty settled over him like stone. And yet, this was still not the end of the advisor's revelations. Because in the final section of the dossier, tucked into a sealed envelope, was something even more alarming. A report about a separate development. Something that had happened independently of the children's documentation issues. Something that had taken place overseas. Something that deeply involved Prince Harry. And when the advisor revealed what Harry had done, the room froze. No one breathed. No one blinked. Even the king's posture shifted sharply forward. This revelation wasn't about paperwork, or protocol, or ceremonies, or documents, or ambiguity. It was about betrayal. A betrayal the king never expected from his own son. A betrayal that overshadowed everything that came before. A betrayal that solidified the king's final decision. And what Harry did would push the situation from risky to catastrophic, but no one saw it coming. Every monarch faces a crisis at least once in their reign. Some face wars. Some face revolutions. Some face scandals so deep they nearly break the crown. But never in modern memory has a monarch faced a crisis that came from his own bloodline. His own son, his own grandchildren, his own family. But that is exactly what King Charles faced the moment he finished reading the advisor's whistleblower dossier. It wasn't anger he felt. It wasn't betrayal. Not at first. What he felt was something even more dangerous. Fear. The kind of fear that settles deep inside the chest, slow and heavy, like a warning bell that refuses to stop ringing. Fear that the monarchy, an institution that survived world wars, abdications, divorces, deaths, scandals, and public rebellions, was now facing a new kind of threat, one born not of politics, not of foreign enemies, but of modern uncertainty. The kind of uncertainty that cracks foundations. The kind of uncertainty that invites chaos. And in that moment, Charles understood something he had never allowed himself to admit before. The monarchy was no longer stable. Not with Harry, not with Meghan, not with their children, not with the shifting public narrative, not with the global media frenzy, not with the American complications, not with the incomplete documentation, not with the unanswered questions, not with the architectural gaps in the succession line. For the first time, the king realized he could lose control. And a monarch who loses control loses everything. The room goes silent. After the advisor revealed the final piece of information, Harry's secret involvement in a project that used royal ties without palace authorization, the room fell silent. Not ordinary silence. Not respectful silence. A suffocating silence. A silence thick with disbelief. The senior legal counsel looked down at the table. The private secretary blinked several times, as if trying to process the implications. The advisor simply stared at the king, waiting for him to speak. But Charles didn't speak. He just sat there, his jaw clenched, his hands interlocked, his breathing shallow. Inside his head, the past decade replayed itself. Every warning, every red flag, every plea for caution, every time he hoped things would get better, every time he convinced himself Harry still believed in the family, every time he pretended the situation was salvageable. And now, looking at the evidence before him, he saw the truth clearly for the first time. The monarchy wasn't dealing with a rebellious son. It was dealing with a destabilizing force that had grown far beyond individual choices. A force with global reach. A force with media power. A force that rejected the hierarchy. A force that refused palace oversight. A force influenced by external networks, industries, ideologies, and interests. And that force now had two children positioned within the line of succession. That was the breaking point. The king's internal struggle. Charles's mind warred with itself. His instincts as a father battled against his responsibilities as a monarch. Two voices in his head pulled him in opposite directions. One whispered, "This is your son. This is your family. This is blood."